Think of the Middle Ages, and most people picture stone churches, stern priests and peasants devoted to prayer and chastity. It's a familiar image, quiet villages, where morality reigned supreme, and anything remotely sexual was repressed or punished. But what if the opposite was true? What if behind those cathedral walls and castle gates lay a world so drenched in desire, superstition, and hypocrisy that it makes modern nightlife look tame by comparison? Medieval Europe was not the sterile, prudish society many imagine. It was a world driven by impulses, guided by strange beliefs, and governed by a set of rules so contradictory that sin and salvation often walked hand in hand. The church might have thundered sermons about purity from the pulpits, but outside those echoing halls, people were devising their own elaborate systems to explore, enhance, and sometimes weaponize sexuality. These weren't isolated, hidden practices. They were embedded into the everyday fabric of life. Courtship wasn't just romantic, it involved physical restraint devices and wooden barriers in the bed. Wedding celebrations didn't end with polite toasts, they launched into aphrodisiac feasts focused on animal genitals and spice-based stimulants. And marriage itself didn't truly exist until a group of witnesses, family nobles, and even clergy watched the newlyweds consummate the union. In public, with commentary. The contradiction wasn't just cultural, it was deeply psychological. Medieval society feared uncontrolled desire, but believed passionately in sympathetic magic astrology and divine intervention. It built vast cathedrals dedicated to saints, while simultaneously blessing fertility belts and magical underwear engraved with mystical sigils. These people sincerely believed that tying off a testicle or positioning a bed toward the rising sun could determine the gender of a future child. They spent fortunes on spices not for flavor, but for lust. And in the ultimate twist of hypocrisy, the very institution that preached abstinence, the church was running Europe's most profitable prostitution network. This journey will take you through a world where meals were served to ignite desire, where courts supervised sexual performance, and where the line between religion and eroticism was blurred beyond recognition. By the time you reach the end, it won't be the myth of medieval chastity that survives, but the far more unsettling truth the Middle Ages weren't dark because nobody was having sex. They were dark because of what people were willing to do in pursuit of it. Bundling. At first glance, the word sounds almost cozy, like something involving blankets and warmth on a cold winter night. And in a way, it was. But for thousands of young medieval couples, it was also an awkward, highly controlled ritual that turned courtship into a bizarre test of restraint. Imagine you're a young man in a rural village. Your parents have arranged a potential match for you, and the time has come to get to know her better. There is no candlelit dinner, no gentle stroll under the village walls. Instead, you are escorted into her family's home, stripped of your belt and boots, and wrapped tightly in a long sack made of wool or linen. She is bundled into another sack and placed beside you in bed. Between the two sacks is a thick wooden board, like a makeshift chastity wall. Then her parents wish you a pleasant night and extinguish the candles. To modern eyes, it feels like a cruel prank. But for medieval families, bundling was an ingenious compromise, a supervised sleepover that allowed emotional intimacy without the risk of physical sin. That was the theory, at least. In reality, bundling unleashed exactly the kinds of desire it was trying to contain. Historical parish records reveal soaring rates of premarital pregnancy in regions where bundling was commonplace. Whether they slipped around the wooden board or tore open the sacks entirely, young people found their way past the barriers. One German village court record describes a case where the board was literally whittled down bit by bit over successive nights, until nothing remained except sawdust and scandal. Religious authorities were horrified. Priests railed against the practice, calling it a doorway to moral disaster and licentious in the image of Sodom. But the protests fell on deaf ears. In remote farming communities where long hours and isolation made traditional courting, difficult bundling was seen as practical, even respectable. Some families invested in specially embroidered bundling bags with family crests, turning them into heirlooms passed from one generation to the next. It wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated. What made bundling even more absurd was the cognitive dissonance surrounding it. Parents who insisted their children sleep fully clothed, bound in cloth and separated by timber, were the same parents who knowingly left them alone in the dark for hours. They believed that proximity without touch would purify desire. But proximity often breeds the very thing it tries to prevent. The human heart, especially the young and curious one, rarely obeys wooden rules. And in medieval Europe, it obeyed them even less. If bundling was an attempt to restrain desire, medieval cuisine was a full-throated invitation to indulge it. Food in this era wasn't simply nourishment, it was alchemy. Every ingredient was believed to carry hidden properties capable of altering a person's temperament, mood, and most importantly, their lust. And so emerged the great culinary tradition of the aphrodisiac feast, a ritualized banquet designed not merely to satisfy hunger, but to ignite the body with almost supernatural desire. At the center of these medieval love feasts were animal testicles, delicately known as stones. Bulls, rams, boars, and even exotic animals imported at great expense were butchered for their reproductive organs, which were roasted, stewed, fried in spiced oils, or powdered and blended into wine. The symbolism was unmistakable: eat virility, and you become virile. Medieval recipe books spoke plainly of it. Take ye fresh stones of young beasts, and boil them in wine with pepper and ginger, that lust may enter the heart. This wasn't fringe advice, it came from respected physicians and scholars, men who had studied at Europe's great universities. But the list didn't stop at testicles. Sparrow brains were widely believed to heighten male sexual enthusiasm. The spice trade, often remembered as an engine of commerce and empire, was also a highway for lust. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, and clove were not just ingredients, they were catalysts. Nobles would pay the price of a small fortune for a pinch of cinnamon because it was thought to sharpen desire. In castle kitchens across Europe, cooks prepared dishes so heavily spiced that they burned the tongue, all in the hope of fueling what they called the heat of generation. Weddings became the ultimate stage for these culinary spectacles. Newly married couples weren't given quiet meals and privacy. Instead, they were treated to elaborate 7- or 8-course feasts composed entirely of aphrodisiac dishes. Pine nuts, almonds, sweet honey figs soaked in wine, and ground stone powder were served with great ceremony. Guests were expected not just to eat, but to participate in the ritual, raising toasts, offering blessings, and joking loudly about fertility and potency. These feasts often ended with the newlyweds being escorted directly to their bedchamber, their stomachs full of what was essentially medieval Viagra, their heads spinning from the spiced wine. What's most striking is how medical, religious, and magical ideas merged seamlessly in these meals. Physicians wrote treatises that read like cookbooks. Priests blessed the dishes to increase their efficacy, and nobles treated them as a symbol of wealth and status. For the medieval mind, there was nothing contradictory about this. Food was a sacred instrument of creation, and preparing it properly could bend the will of the body. In this world, a stew wasn't just a meal, it was a spell. The wedding feast might have ended in raucous celebration, but the real ceremony, at least in the eyes of medieval law, was still to come. For in the aristocratic world of Europe, a marriage wasn't truly valid until consummation had occurred. and consummation incredibly was deemed far too important to be left in private hands. It had to be witnessed. The bedding ceremony began the moment the last cup of spiced wine was drained. The guests' nobles' clergy relatives formed a solemn procession, escorting the bride and groom to their chamber with the same gravity reserved for funerals or royal coronations. In wealthy households, special bedding songs were sung as they entered the room. There was nothing discreet about it. The bride was carefully undressed by her female relatives, layer by layer, until she stood in nothing but her shift. At the same time, the groom was undressed by his male relatives, who often cracked jokes or offered crude advice about what was expected. Once in bed, the couple were surrounded by a semicircle of witnesses who stood close enough to observe everything. Some spoke prayers aloud, invoking the saints to bless the union. Others simply watched in silence. And then the doors were closed. What followed wasn't a symbolic ritual. It was the actual consummation of the marriage performed under the watchful gaze of family and church officials. In some regions, witnesses were permitted to encourage or advise. There are recorded cases of noblewomen offering verbal instructions, while the bridal couple struggled awkwardly beneath the sheets. As shocking as this sounds, it made perfect sense to medieval society. Marriage wasn't just about love, it involved massive transfers of land titles and political power. To ensure that the union was genuine and legally binding, consummation had to be proven beyond doubt, and physical proof was required. After the act, the couple would rise from the bed, and the sheets would be inspected for signs of blood confirming the bride's virginity. These bloodstains were considered formal evidence, sometimes even kept in church archives alongside the marriage contract. Attempts to bypass the tradition rarely succeeded. In one French case, a noble couple tried to convince their witnesses to wait in the hallway. The court later ruled the consummation invalid because no one had actually seen the physical act. They were forced to repeat the entire ceremony with full audience before the marriage could be recognized. The humiliation was relentless, but the logic was clear. The stakes were too high to rely on trust. Etiquette manuals even laid out precise rules for witnesses: where to stand, how much to speak. Whether it was appropriate to applaud, it wasn't. Voyeurism was turned into a legal institution, complete with protocols and social norms. In this world, privacy didn't strengthen marriage. Public scrutiny did. And so the most intimate act between two people became a performance staged before the very society that claimed to protect virtue. In the medieval mind, sex was never simply about desire. It was a ritual with cosmic consequences governed by the alignment of planets, the balance of bodily humors, and the sacred calendar of the church. Conceiving a child wasn't a result of chance. It was a puzzle of extraordinary complexity. And so couples of means approached it with all the rigor of a military strategist preparing for battle. Astrologers played a central role in this process. Before attempting conception, noble couples would consult star charts to determine whether Mars or Saturn held undue influence over their fates and whether the moon was waxing or waning. A waxing moon encouraged male offspring. A waning moon risked bringing softness into the blood, allegedly leading to female births. Sex on a night ruled by Venus and Jupiter was said to produce handsome, healthy children. On nights ruled by Saturn, it might produce sickly or melancholy offspring. These astrological schedules were compiled into elaborate conception calendars, some of which still survive in monastic libraries. Medieval medical theory then added a second layer of complexity. According to the prevailing belief in humoral balance, the woman's body had to be hot and moist in order to conceive successfully. Physicians therefore recommended midnight as the ideal hour when the natural heat of the body was highest and warm, windless weather to preserve the internal balance of fluids. Instructions were astonishingly specific: position the bed facing east toward the rising sun. Place a sprig of rosemary under the pillow to prevent demonic interference, and tie a silk ribbon around the left wrist of the woman to ensure the heat of life flowed into the womb. Then came the gender prescriptions. To conceive a boy, the man was told to tie off his left testicle with a linen thread and keep his right foot slightly elevated during intercourse, because boys were believed to originate from the right side of the body. To conceive a girl, the opposite procedure was recommended. Some manuals advised avoiding salty foods in the days leading up to conception, as salt was thought to harden the male seed and therefore bias the child toward masculinity. Copious examples in court records reveal couples traveling hundreds of miles to reach holy shrines during predicted fertility windows, believing the sanctity of the location amplified conception. And overlaying all of this was the authority of the Church. Religious doctrine prohibited sex on an astonishing number of days every Sunday in honor of the resurrection, every Wednesday and Friday in memory of Christ's betrayal and crucifixion, the entire seasons of Lent and Advent, feast days of major saints, periods of fasting, times of menstruation, pregnancy, and breastfeeding. One 14th century bishop calculated that only 89 nights of the year were appropriate for non-sinful intercourse. The result was something close to insanity, couples desperately scanning multiple calendars, astrological, religious, medical, just to find a single night when the stars, the saints, and their own humors aligned. What should have been the most natural act in human life became a choreographed performance governed by superstition and sacred fear. Every decision, date, hour, direction, posture carried the weight of heaven and earth. Failure to follow the proper formula might result not just in infertility, but in an ill-formed, spiritually compromised child. In the medieval world, even love obeyed the stars. If planets and prayer determined when to conceive, physical objects were believed to determine whether conception would happen at all. Medieval Europe developed an entire industry around fertility. Accessories, garments, stones, belts, rings, each crafted with the conviction that magical symbols could influence the mysteries of the body. And people didn't just believe in them, they relied on them. The most iconic of these was the girdle of Venus. Far from being a poetic metaphor, it was a real physical belt worn around the waist or hips, often made of silk, imported from the East, and embroidered with Latin prayers, astrological sigils, and invocations of saints. Women wore the girdle during intercourse, believing it guided the seed to the womb and shielded the unborn child from demonic interference. These belts could be breathtaking works of art, woven with gold thread and gemstones passed down from mother to daughter like sacred relics. Doctors and priests alike recommended them not as symbols, but as active medical interventions. Then there were conception stones, small crystals or rocks polished smooth and carried inside a woman's undergarments during sex. Different stones were believed to confer different outcomes: emeralds for boys, sapphires for girls, diamonds for twins. Some were engraved with zodiac symbols or dipped in blessed water before use. A 13th century midwife's manual contains precise instructions. Speak the name of the desired child while placing the stone upon the flesh, that heaven may consign its blessing to the womb. Amulets were equally popular. These tiny charms contained everything from powdered unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk, to fragments of relics taken from saints' shrines. Some included scraps of parchment inscribed with prayers folded into tiny metal casings and worn around the neck or wrist. One surviving example from Italy contains a verse from the Gospel of John, accompanied by a surprisingly explicit diagram of the female reproductive organs. Men were not excluded from this obsession. They wore rings carved with astrological signs or braided cords containing dried animal testicles believed to increase virility. Blessed loincloths were especially prized. Priests would sprinkle them with holy water and recite prayers before giving them to the groom on the wedding night. For the man who could afford it, there was even a three-piece set of fertility ring, a sanctified loincloth, and a phylactery to be tied around the upper arm, all worn together to guarantee performance and potency. Naturally, all of this created a hierarchy. The wealthy displayed their magical garments like status symbols, commissioning master craftsmen to embed precious stones or embroider entire psalms in gold thread. The poor improvised, substituting local stones for gemstones, carving crude symbols into strips of cloth, whispering folk charms instead of paying a priest. Yet the belief was universal. The right accessory could persuade nature, fate, and even God himself. In some marriages, these objects became non-negotiable. There are recorded cases of husbands refusing sex if their wives were not properly girdled, fearing that unprotected intercourse might offend heavenly powers. Getting dressed became a spiritual ritual. Desire itself was framed as something fragile and sacred, something that needed to be guided by silk and gemstone prayer and spell. Medieval marriage was theoretically indissoluble, a sacred contract bound by God and therefore unbreakable by man. And yet in practice there existed one loophole, so humiliating, so invasive, that to invoke it was to drag one's private life into the harshest public light, the impotence trial. If a wife claimed that her husband was incapable of consummating their marriage, the church courts were obliged to investigate. But medieval law insisted on proof, hard physical proof. The first step was a medical examination conducted by court-appointed physicians. Husband and wife were examined separately. The man's genitals were inspected for natural integrity and any signs of defect. He was questioned in agonizing detail. How often had he attempted intercourse? At what hours? In what physical condition? Did he experience arousal? How long did it last? These answers were recorded and compared with his wife's testimony. If inconsistencies appeared, or if the exam was inconclusive, the court ordered the unimaginable, a trial by Congress. The couple would be placed in a chamber prepared by the court, sometimes located inside the courthouse itself, other times in a rented room at a nearby inn. The bed would be inspected beforehand to verify there were no aphrodisiac substances hidden among the sheets. Court officials and physicians would then take their positions, some behind screens, some watching through peepholes in the walls. A clerk documented the attempt. The man was allotted a specific time to demonstrate conjugal performance. Should he fail, the proceedings intensified. Additional attempts could be ordered, sometimes weeks apart. In one case from Paris, a man underwent 13 supervised trials over the course of 2 years before the court finally annulled the marriage. He left the courtroom publicly branded as impotent, his reputation ruined beyond repair. Others tried to cheat the system by smuggling herbal stimulants or magical amulets into the trial chamber. When caught, they were forced to undergo additional searches and more humiliating scrutiny. The wife, meanwhile, had to prove she was ready and willing. She was examined for anatomical abnormalities, questioned about her interest in intercourse, and even asked whether she experienced physical arousal. If she seemed disinterested or unenthusiastic, the blame could shift to her, and the court might accuse her of causing the failure. There are records of women being ordered to drink aphrodisiac tonics or undergo spiritual confession before the next trial, a grotesque fusion of medicine and theology. Whether the case ended in annulment or not, the social consequences were devastating. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered, nobles mocked, songs were written. The very act of bringing the accusation ensured that intimate details of one's marriage became public gossip. Many husbands, desperate to avoid such exposure, chose to accept annulment rather than face the public trial. In doing so, they effectively confessed to impotence just to escape the spectacle. In these trials, love and dignity were irrelevant. What mattered were visible results documented and witnessed. The medieval world demanded proof of potency not in private, but under the gaze of the law. And in doing so, it transformed one of the most personal struggles a human can face into a legal performance staged for judges, priests, and strangers alike. The medieval church condemned lust from the pulpit, preaching chastity and self-control as cardinal virtues. But behind closed doors, and often quite openly, it was also one of the largest administrators of sex work in Europe. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the city of London, where by the 12th century, an entire district south of the Thames was devoted to licensed brothels. The land and buildings in this red-lit borough belonged not to private citizens or secular authorities, but to the Bishop of Winchester. The clergy referred to the prostitutes who worked there with extraordinary frankness. They were Winchester geese. This was not some hidden, shameful side hustle. Church authorities openly justified the practice. They argued that prostitution served a vital function in society, preventing greater sins such as rape, adultery, and sodomy. If men had access to prostitutes, they were less likely to violate respectable women or dabble in unnatural acts. In effect, the church cast sex workers as a kind of moral safety valve, sacrificial figures, absorbing the lust that might otherwise corrupt the righteous. And of course, there was profit. Brothels operating on church land paid rent to the ecclesiastical authorities, who in turn collected taxes and fees from brothel keepers. The workers were subject to an elaborate set of regulations. They had to wear distinct clothing so they could be easily identified in public. They were forbidden from working on religious feast days. They could not refuse patrons without legitimate cause. Regular medical inspections were mandated ostensibly to prevent the spread of disease, but also to protect the church's investment. Money flowed upward in an almost feudal pyramid. The prostitute paid the brothel keeper. The keeper paid rent to the landholder. The landholder paid a portion of his income to the bishopric. Documents show that revenue from these operations was used to fund the construction of chapels, repair cathedral roofs, and sponsor religious festivals. Worshippers prayed beneath vaulted ceilings paid for, quite literally, by sin. When reformers occasionally tried to shut the system down, they were met with intense resistance from both clergy and merchants. The church insisted it was protecting society. Town officials pointed to the economic benefits. Prostitutes were treated as necessary instruments of civic stability. And even when moral outrage flared, it often resulted not in closure, but in stricter regulation, more rules, more inspections, more control. For centuries, this hypocrisy persisted. Sermons thundered against lust while church coffers swelled with money earned from it. Priests and bishops denounced the very industry their institutions owned. It was in many ways the most extraordinary contradiction of the medieval world, the guardians of morality quietly operating a system of sanctioned vice, convinced or pretending to be convinced that they were saving souls by profiting from the bodies of the vulnerable. If medieval Europe exerted astonishing effort to encourage sexual potency and fertility, it showed equal creativity when it came to preventing conception. Birth control was not only desired, it was desperately sought after in a world where bearing too many children could mean poverty, illness, and even death. But without scientific understanding, people turned to a remarkable combination of folk wisdom, medical misconception, and outright magic. The most common method involved animal testicles again. Women would carry small pouches containing dried weasel or beaver testicles around their necks or tied to their waist. The logic was rooted in sympathetic magic weasels were notoriously sexually active, yet produced small litters. Therefore, wearing a piece of their reproductive organs would supposedly transfer limited fertility to the woman. Recipes from monastery infirmaries recommended steeping powdered beaver testicle in wine and drinking it before intercourse as a contraceptive tonic. Predictably, it was not effective. Occasionally, it was lethal. Other potions were equally dangerous. One Anglo-Norman manuscript suggests that women drink a mixture of powdered iron filings and vinegar to close the womb. Italian herbalists recommended mercury dissolved in wine. Several women reportedly died of poisoning after following these remedies, a tragic irony, as death was one of the few reliable ways to ensure avoidance of pregnancy. Some methods attempted to remove the male seed through physical force. Physicians recommended that women sneeze forcefully immediately after intercourse in order to expel the seed. Many carried pepper or ground mustard with them to induce instant sneezing. They were advised to jump up and down afterward or run in circles while coughing to complete the cleansing. One popular French guide recommended that women raise the legs thrice toward the heavens, then walk backwards to the bed. Physical barriers were perhaps the most unsettling. Honey-soaked wool was inserted into the vagina to block the passage of semen. Some women used balls of linen dipped in vinegar, believing the acidity would kill sperm. In Egypt and southern Europe, crocodile dung imported in dried form was mixed with herbs and placed inside the body as a kind of medieval spermicide. The harshness of these substances often caused infection, but the practice continued for centuries. Timing methods were widespread too, but based on completely incorrect assumptions. Medieval physicians believed women were most fertile during menstruation and least fertile in the middle of their cycle. Couples who wished to avoid pregnancy therefore had sex during what was actually the most fertile period, effectively guaranteeing conception. Even withdrawal was known but strongly discouraged. Male physicians warned that withdrawing before ejaculation would allow corrupted seed to rise back into the man's body, leading to insanity, blindness, and sometimes death. Magical contraception formed an entire separate category. Women carried small stones etched with crescent moons, wore amulets engraved with the names of obscure angels, or whispered incantations while burning specific herbs. One English charm instructed the woman to walk around a church backwards 3 times and bury a piece of bread beneath a yew tree in order to ensure barrenness of the womb. Another advised reciting the Lord's Prayer in reverse immediately after intercourse. Whether or not these worked, they didn't. They provided an illusion of control in a world governed by fear and chance. What all these methods reveal is not simply ignorance, but deep anxiety. Medieval people were willing to risk pain, humiliation, and even death to prevent unwanted pregnancy. In doing so, they left behind a haunting record of creative desperation, a testament to just how far the human mind will go when faced with the uncontrollable forces of nature and desire. By the time we step back from this labyrinth of superstition, ceremony, and contradiction, one thing becomes clear: medieval attitudes toward sex were not merely strange, they were profoundly human. They reveal a world trying desperately to impose order on one of the most uncontrollable aspects of existence. In bundling bags and bedding ceremonies, in fertility belts and impotence trials, in aphrodisiac feasts and church-run brothels, we see the same forces that shape human behavior. Today, anxiety, desire, power, fear, and belief. Medieval societies talked endlessly about purity, yet they created rituals that turned sex into public performance. They feared uncontrolled lust, yet built entire cuisines dedicated to stimulating it. They treated fertility as sacred, yet administered its mysteries with bureaucracy worthy of a royal court. For every sermon against sin, there was a sacred girdle. For every prohibition on intercourse, there was an astrologer ready to schedule it. For every call to chastity, there was a brothel operating under holy patronage. What seems bizarre to us was perfectly rational to them. In a world where disease and death were constant companions and scientific knowledge was scarce, people reached for whatever tools they could. Magic and medicine were not opposites, they were intertwined. Faith and desire were not in conflict. They were part of the same mysterious force that governed life. The stars could bless a child. A gemstone could shape a womb. A testicle dried and powdered could summon or banish fertility. It is tempting to look back with amusement or horror. But the deeper truth is that these practices, as absurd as they sometimes appear, emerged from a sincere attempt to make sense of the most overwhelming human experiences. They remind us that sexuality has never been simply physical. It carries hopes, fears, power, identity, and belief. And although the methods have changed the impulse to control, guide, or enhance, it remains as strong today as it was 600 years ago. So the next time someone imagines the Middle Ages as an era of cold stone and silent monasteries, remember this: the darkness wasn't caused by a lack of passion. It was caused by how fiercely people tried to control it.